I was deep in the Russian rear and I had to figure out a way to get to the German side. I tried various options, and none of them were good. To overcome on foot the huge distances that separated me from my comrades would have been foolish. It was winter, being outside was dangerous not only because of the cold temperatures, but also because it increased my risk of being caught. Taking a bus or train was not an option for me, primarily due to my lack of documentation. As we went through our options, the conversation became less animated and more somber. Soon I would have to leave here and return to the streets of the city. I have to come to some kind of decision. Nicholas then came up with a plan. He realized that he was somewhat out of the bounds of acceptable risk, but in his opinion, the plan was doable. Nikolay told me that since I knew Polish, I could join the Polish army. There was the headquarters of the Russian army in the city. Maybe I could apply there with a request to send me to the Polish army. And once there, it would be easier for me to be out of reach of the Russians. At first, Nikolay's wife laughed at the idea. But when we continued to discuss the subject, she remarked that in this way, I would be able to walk the streets in peace since I would have documents. I would be able to move around and eventually find my way to the German side. I scratched my chin and looked at both of them. They were looking at me too, waiting for a reaction. I lowered my head again, leaning over my coffee cup. This was crazy, but it might have been my best opportunity. Without raising my head, I replied, I think it's a great idea. I knew that Nikolay and his wife were treating me well. I was struck again by the kindness of the people on this earth, as I had already had the opportunity to witness the efforts and sacrifices they were making for me. I was uncomfortable thinking about it, realizing that I had brought so much misery and destruction to their land. I remembered our journey from Slaviansk as we blew up and burned everything in our path. We had brought so much misery to ordinary people like Nikolay and his wife. It was crazy to even think that in order to keep myself safe from the Red Army, I would have to go straight to a Russian military establishment. That in itself required separate planning. I asked Nikolay if he would be so kind as to get me some Russian letters of recommendation. I will do it right away, he replied, and with these words he got up from the table, put on his coat, and left the house. His wife also got up and began to clear the table. Don't worry, Oscar, she said to me, everything will be all right. In the meantime, I insist that you spend the night here with us. I thanked her again for dinner and for her hospitality. I remained seated at the table to keep her company while she washed pots and plates. When she finished, she went out and soon returned with a blanket and a sheet that she was going to lay on the couch. After making my bed, embarrassed for a second, she said, if you want, you can take a bath and clean yourself up. I was filthy, and she was obviously worried about the condition of the blanket and the couch itself. Sure, thanks again. I haven't had a bath in weeks, even months, since I was captured. I'm sure that fact didn't escape her notice. When I finished bathing and returned to the hall, Nikolay had already managed to return. He worriedly handed me a stack of papers folded together. I opened them and began to scrutinize them. It said that I was a Polish citizen, that the Germans had sent me to work in Russia. The document was signed on December 19 by Colonel Malinowski. Nikolay advised me to take the papers to the recruitment office, which was located at the other end of the city. Now you need to go and get some sleep, he added. You'll have to start acting right from early morning, but not too early so as not to arouse unnecessary suspicion. I said goodnight to the couple and settled down on the couch for a nap. I was anticipating it. Sleeping on the couch was another luxury I had been deprived of for many months. I slept through the night and rose early the next morning, then walked quietly out of the house and headed in the direction of Moskravskaya 38th Street. Nikolay also got up to see me off. As I left the house, he warned me not to mention my meeting with him anywhere. Otherwise, someone would be able to trace the path to him using forged documents. I nodded and thanked him again. Now that I had the documents, I felt much more confident. I walked openly through the city to the military recruiting station. I held my head high on the way, as if those papers were a shield for me to ward off anyone who might want to harm me. I arrived at the place by about 9 a.m. and found that the conscription office was a large military facility like a similar institution in Germany. Nicholas believed that if I was accepted here for service in the Polish army, I would be sent to the vicinity of Kharkov to the formation sites. It was time to put the plan into action. I went to the central part of the complex and found what I thought was the office where recruits were recruited. Soon someone noticed me and approached me. I proudly handed the documents I had brought with me to the major and announced that I had come here to enlist in the Polish army. The face of the officer who was going through my papers remained impenetrable. Without looking at me, he asked me a few general questions. I answered confidently, although I was not entirely sure of what I was saying. When the exchange was over, he raised his head and gave me a quick, attentive look. Then he motioned for me to sit down. The officer watched me take one of the nearby chairs. He remained seated at the desk and was still looking at the paperwork. He then stood up and instructed me to wait a few minutes. As he passed me, he offered me a cigarette. I took it and thanked him. He stopped to give me a light, then left the room. Almost immediately, two others entered the room armed with automatic rifles. They reminded me very much of NKVD officers. "Follow us," ordered one of them. I stood up silently and waited for them to lead me. The two guards escorted me back out the door, then further down the street to the tall building that housed the NKVD. This place was familiar to me. I had already been here when our division was stationed in Dnipropetrovsk. I recognized the building to which I was brought. Here, at the time when this area was occupied by the Germans, was the Gestapo. The guards took me into a small room and searched me. This clearly indicated that I was in trouble. I tried to remain calm and act as if I had not expected to be treated differently. After the examination of my clothes was over, I was taken to another office to another officer. Without saying a word, the guard who had my papers handed them to this officer. He accepted the papers and my escorts left. The officer looked at me briefly, then took the documents Nikolay had given me in his hands and began to scrutinize them. After a minute, he threw them carelessly on the table in front of him, looked at me and asked sternly, "Did you prepare these documents yourself?" "No," I answered calmly. "How can you? I don't even know how to write Russian." "But you do speak Russian, don't you?" The officer asked. That was an oversight on my part. A lump formed in my stomach and began to grow. I looked at the Russian but said nothing. "Where are you from?" He continued, "Where did you come from?" "I came from here, from Dnipropetrovsk. I am here to join the Polish army." Thereupon the officer abruptly ended the conversation. His behavior was incomprehensible. It indicated that something was terribly wrong. The Russian pressed a button on his desk, and soon one of the guards returned. The escort took a seat behind me with the barrel of an automatic rifle pointed at my back. The officer ordered me to be taken to Office 98. The guard with the machine gun walked around me, looked me in the face, and commanded, "Let's go." I followed him down a long corridor. As we walked down it, we had to pass several people who were scrutinizing me. I tried very hard to look as carefree as possible, to give the impression of my complete innocence, as if everything that had happened had been a big mistake. In Office 98, where we soon arrived, sat several NKVD officers, including the major with whom I had already spoken. One of the officers offered me a chair next to him, where I sat down. The major asked me if I had eaten anything today. I answered that I had not. Then the man who had offered me the chair left the room and returned a few minutes later with food for me. He placed a tray in front of me with some kind of soup, a piece of bread, and some cheese. I looked around. All the officers were looking at me and cheering me on. "Eat, eat." They were watching my every move. I looked around again. I knew exactly where I was. I was now placed under the jurisdiction of the GPU 39. During the war, we had heard a lot about this organization. It was a very difficult moment, and I summoned all my faith in God, asking him to help me through this ordeal. I thanked that man and began to silently eat what he had brought, while the others were watching me. After I had eaten, another officer brought me a cigarette. I must say that everyone behaved very politely. We all knew what was going to happen later. It all starts with being taken into your confidence by offering you food and cigarettes, and then 5 minutes later the interrogation begins. Each of the officers in the room had a notebook with them. To the right of the major sat the stenographer. The scribe was writing down all my answers. The officers were also writing something in their notebooks, obviously describing their own observations. What are you doing in Russia? The major continued. I was working in Dnipropetrovsk for a German firm. At the moment when the German troops retreated from the city, I was far from Dnipropetrovsk in a small village. I do not know the name of this settlement. One of the officers put a new sheet of paper in front of the major. I continued. I want to be away from the Germans. I do not wish to work for them any longer. Someone among the civilians whom I met in that settlement told me that when the front moved away from here, I should enlist in the Polish army because I was a Polish citizen. I took his advice and left the settlement, heading this way. 2 weeks passed and the Germans retreated. They left in the evening, and in the morning the Russians came here. I went to the Russian commander, and he gave me the documents that are now in front of you. He told me to go with them to the recruiting center in Dnipropetrovsk. That's all I can say. One of the officers asked, can you remember anything about the village where you were? Would you be able to find it if someone accompanied you? I replied to this. I don't think I could look for that settlement again. He asked me again, do you have any acquaintances in Dnipropetrovsk? No, I replied, I came here in search of work. The people in the room looked at each other again. The officer who was interrogating me continued to write something in his notebook. When he finished, he looked at me and asked, is everything you just said true? Yes, it is true, I answered immediately. Then please sign here to confirm it. The officer tore out a sheet from his notebook and held it out to me. I immediately took the document from him, signed it, and handed it back. With a satisfied look, the officer handed the sheet to the major sitting behind the desk. The major took the paper, gave it a quick glance, and called for a convoy. 2 men with automatic rifles immediately appeared in the room. Standing behind me, they ordered me to go with them. I obeyed readily. The 3 of us walked back down the hallway and out of the building. We walked a short distance through the city to the next building. It had small, barred windows on it. It wasn't hard to guess what it housed. When we got inside, the guards led me to a small room around the corner, where a man was sitting at a large table. It was clear that this was the prison authorities. The guards turned around and walked out. The jailer looked at me with a quick glance. Take off your suspenders and give them to me, he ordered curtly. I obeyed silently. He took the suspenders from me and put them on the table. Now take everything out of your pockets and put them on the table. I reached into my pocket and found that there was still half a slice of bread and a piece of dried meat, with which Nicholas had provided me at parting. I also had 2 pairs of gloves, which I also laid on the table in front of the jailer, but he gestured to me that I could keep them. Turn out your pockets so that I can see they are empty, he continued. Now turn around. He continued to examine me without leaving the table. At last, feeling satisfied, he rose from his chair and said, come with me. The jailer led me down a long corridor, and I held my pants with my hands. It was dark and cold. Only our footsteps broke the silence. On either side of the corridor were iron doors with a padlock and a small hinged hatch that closed the window and the door. As we approached the room that was to be my cell, the prison guard pulled out a set of keys and opened the door lock. The door opened with a loud noise that echoed throughout the hallway. For some reason, the sound made me think of an ancient church. This setting was in stark contrast to my previous imprisonment, which made part of me feel happy that I would be kept in such a place. It looked like I would at least be taken care of, and no one here would shoot me. I thought about how long I would be kept here, but I was not given time to think about it properly, for I was distracted by the warden, who quickly took away my gloves, perhaps because he did not have any himself. This kind of behavior was typical of Russians. If you have something they want, they immediately decide that the item no longer belongs to you, but is now the property of the state. Just then I got a poke in the back and found myself in the middle of the cell, and the door slammed shut behind me. I looked around the dimly lit room and found 4 high walls, a small barred window, and 7 men. They greeted me warmly as another of those who would share their suffering. At first I thought that all the men standing in front of me looked very well, that they had full faces. This, I assumed, was a sign that I would be well cared for in this facility. But I was soon convinced that I was wrong, for I heard that their stomachs were bloated from malnutrition. All 7 were Russian, and each had been accused of one crime or another. They were glad of the addition to their company, and each was burning to talk to me. It was not long before I made friends with all of them and learned about what had happened to each of them. The first of the prisoners was an engineer who worked in a factory in Germany. The second was the director of a dairy that produced butter, milk, and sour cream for German military hospitals. The third was burgomaster of a nearby town. The fourth headed a railroad station in Dnipropetrovsk. The fifth was a barber and served German soldiers. The sixth worked in Pavlograd for a company that produced sunflower oil. Finally, the seventh worked under the Germans in the police. This seventh was the youngest. He was only 21 years old. He was very cheerful and spoke German well. On the occasion of my imprisonment, he hummed the song Ich bin der Bub vom Voldedel to me again and again. The youngest was given the longest sentence, 20 years in Siberia. An engineer, a supervisor at a railroad station, a director of a dairy, all received 15 years in Siberia. 2 of them got 10 years and 1 got 7. I had yet to await my sentence. It was more than cool in the cell, only plus 4 degrees Celsius. There was no stove for heating. The floor was dark stone. There were no benches or other furniture. The only object in the room, besides the 8 of us, was a large bucket that we all used as a toilet. There was no air circulation at all, and the stench from the bucket and the people who had not bathed for weeks or even months was unbearable. As the days went by, we had quiet conversations among ourselves. Each of my cellmates was glad to have a newcomer with whom to share their sad experiences. Everyone wanted to know as much about me as possible, but I avoided talking about it. I only shared with everyone that I was a Polish citizen trying to join the Polish army and that I did not know why I was being held here. The days stretched slowly. When we were freezing, we would wind our steps from one corner of the cell to the other to keep warm. As night fell, we huddled together for the same purpose, like a rat family in its nest. And the lice. It was not lice we had, but we had lice. Early in the morning at 6 o'clock, we were awakened by the warden, and we all took turns to use the bucket. I learned that they only had to eat once a day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Each person was entitled to 250 grams of bread and half a liter of potato water. That was all our ration for the whole day. Night came again, and another day passed in the cell. Conversations became shorter. Eventually, the Russians realized that I did not intend to talk much about myself, and everyone stopped questioning me. From time to time, they talked among themselves, told stories from the past, incidents that had happened in wartime, and even laughed about it. Despite their suffering, they found something in everyone that brought peace to this company. That was what I admired about them. The silence in prison was very annoying, but especially the cold. From time to time, one of us would start pacing back and forth in the cell. The third day came and went. I was still not told a word about what awaited me. After 4 days, I realized that I was getting weaker. It was getting harder and harder to get up off the floor. A week passed, followed by another week. After 15 days, I began to swell up like everyone else. Finally, I reached a point and realized I couldn't take it anymore. With great difficulty, I knocked on the door to get the warden's attention. A second later, I heard someone's footsteps coming from the corridor and stopped in front of our cell. A small door swung open, through which I was asked, "What do you want?" "I want to talk to the warden," I answered in a weak voice. The jailer grinned and closed the window without saying a word, then walked slowly back down the corridor. A few minutes later, he returned. He searched for the keys for a long time, but finally opened the lock and unlocked the door. "Come with me," he said to me. I followed him down the corridor until I was led to a familiar jailer. It was the same guy who had taken my gloves. "Mister," every word was very difficult for me. "I am a Polish citizen. I came here, to this building, to join the army. When I came here, I was locked up. I don't even know why I'm here. Could you please explain to me what is going on?" He took the documents that had been sent with me from the NKVD in his hands and looked through them carelessly. Putting them aside, he explained, "You should remain calm. Paperwork takes a lot of time." "Paperwork for what?" I asked. He looked down at his desk and sighed. "Come with me." He took me to the next room where the major was sitting. Placing the papers in front of the major, the jailer said to him in Russian, "We will send this dog to Siberia for 10 years." I understood what he was saying to the major and asked him, "Why? I haven't done anything." The major looked at me gloomily, showed me a thumbs down sign, and declared, "That doesn't mean anything. No one can just come to Russia like that. You have to go back where you came from." The downward pointing thumb meant that I would never see my home again. I couldn't think of anything in my defense. The head jailer led me out of the office and took me back to the warden, who in turn locked me back in my cell. My fellow prisoners approached me and began to question me quickly about what the major and the prison governor had told me. I answered them briefly and made it clear that I did not wish to discuss it further. There was no point in sharing this information with them, as they could not help me in any way. I was held in that building from December 20 to January 8. We celebrated Christmas and New Year's together, but it didn't feel like a holiday at all. Then, in the early morning of January 8, the warden came to wake us up, but this time he opened the door and called my name. "Yes," I said. "You will come with me." I felt that I would not return to the cell again, so I said goodbye to my comrades in prison suffering. I was sad to leave them in this way. I was amazed that they managed to remain optimistic despite the unbearable conditions we all endured. When they in turn said goodbye to me, they all had the same cheerful and friendly expression on their faces. One of them came up to me to tell me that we would see each other again when we were all taken to Siberia, as if he hoped to share the pleasure of the trip with me. When the warden heard this, he laughed. I went with him again to the prisoner's reception place, where an officer accompanied by 3 machine gunners was waiting for me. Each of the machine gunners had a sack filled with food behind his back. I realized that I was leaving the place and tried to guess where they would take me now. The officer took my papers and quickly looked through them. Then he looked at me and asked me sternly, "Do you speak Russian?" I modestly answered, "Yes." "Good. Now listen to me carefully. Don't do anything stupid on the road. Just one step sideways, left or right, and these 3 soldiers will shoot you. Do you understand?" "Yes," I answered again. It was clear that my situation had not improved at all. The officer folded my papers and handed them to one of the escorts. He gestured silently for me to follow them. They took me out of the prison and led me through the city streets somewhere away from the city center. People looked at me wide-eyed, probably trying to guess what crime I had committed when I was accompanied by 3 guards armed with machine guns. It made me shiver. Soon we reached the railroad station, where even larger crowds of people were staring at me. By the time I reached there, I was tired and exhausted. The lack of nourishment had taken a heavy toll on my body, but my escorts did not let me rest for a second. They nudged me in the back until we reached the platform. I tried to sit on the ground as we waited for the train, but after pointing automatic rifles at me, they forced me to get up and continue standing. After about 20 minutes, the train pulled up and we boarded it. The guards took me to a compartment where I finally had the opportunity to sit down. There was a window to my left. One of the guards sat in the corner of the bench, continuing to watch me. The other 2 sat on the shelf opposite. The lieutenant ordered me to sleep. I chuckled to myself at the thought that someone could order me to go to bed. At 11:10, the train left the station for its journey. The sign on the platform said we were traveling in the direction of Kharkov, Moscow. I leaned against the wall and covered my eyes. This train ride was a long one, through vast, snow-covered fields. As I watched the desolate landscape, my hopes for a favorable outcome grew dimmer and dimmer. I could see that the other passengers on the wagon were feeling curious about me. They asked the lieutenant if I was Russian. He answered again and again that I was a Croat pretending to be a Pole. I understood every word the lieutenant was saying, and I realized that wherever this train was taking me, nothing good was ahead of me. At 3 a.m. we arrived in Kharkiv. We waited for the other passengers to get off, and then my guard took me out of the carriage. We walked through the station and soon found ourselves in the center of the city, and then we reached the NKVD administration building. The lieutenant gave my papers to some officer, and I was ordered to sit and wait for further instructions. After a couple of hours, the lieutenant returned and ordered me to get up. The escorts and I headed back to the train station. This time we boarded a train that was heading south. It took us 2 days and 2 nights to reach our destination. Then the train made a short stop, and we found ourselves in an unmarked place. I listened carefully to what my escorts were saying among themselves. So I learned that our destination was about 23 kilometers south of the city of Stalino. The lieutenant looked at me and informed me in a mocking tone that I would be home again in an hour. In order to get there, I would have to walk about 4 kilometers. We got off the train at a tiny station that seemed to have been hastily erected in the middle of nowhere. The weather was terrible. We were caught in a heavy snowstorm with a hard frost. It was cold to the bones, on which I had too little flesh left to keep those bones warm. Without any halting, we immediately began to trudge through the deep snow. The guards laughed at me and beat me on the back with the barrels of their automatic rifles to keep me moving. In the distance, the outline of what appeared to be a huge prisoner of war camp began to emerge through the snow. It was no surprise to me that my journey was to end in such a place. As we got closer, we suddenly heard through the sounds of the snow being swept away by the storm some extraneous noise. It turned out to be people singing, and it was a very sad song. I expected to hear a German melody, but when I came closer and heard the singing more clearly, I realized with amazement that it was not so. The people were singing in Russian. A little farther down the road, we met a long column of people coming from the camp in the direction from which we had come. Probably their destination was still the same tiny railroad station. It reminded me of an old movie I had seen at home about people being driven to Siberia as punishment. As we walked by, the people in the convoy hardly paid attention to us, busy fighting the elements. I felt very sad. The lieutenant sensed this and took the opportunity to demonstrate his power over me. He pointed with his hand at the column of poor people and said, "See, it's your comrades who are suffering. Welcome home." The rest of the convoy began to giggle.